Welcome to Bricks and Bridges, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We continue our discussion series on treasures of world literature. Tonight, we examine the intricacies of Mexican identity through the lens of Octavio Paz and his classic work, The Labyrinth of Solitude. Bricks and Bridges is a public humanities institute of ideas and conversation. We examine the mysteries and the wisdoms of the world and apply them to modern life. And I also want to thank our partner, Utah Humanities, for funding this event tonight. My name is Nathan Nilsson. I'm your host. Our presenter tonight is Keri González, and our panelist is Alejandro Quinn. Let me introduce Keri. Keri González is originally from Mexico City and currently lives in Salt Lake City, Utah. She completed her undergraduate studies in Hispanic literature at the Autonomous Metropolitan University, earned an MA in Latin American literature from the National Autonomous University of Mexico, and holds a PhD in Spanish and literature from the University of Utah. She specializes in Mexican and Latin American literature with a focus on gender and border studies. Her research interests also include Chicana and Latino literature. Keri has taught courses in world literature, Mexican and Latin American narrative, and narratology in Mexico City. In most recent years, she has taught Spanish at the University of Utah, and she currently works as a Spanish coordinator and director of curriculum of the Bridge program for the Second Language Teaching and Research Center at the University of Utah. Now let me introduce our panelist, Alejandro Quinn. Alejandro is Associate Professor of Spanish in the Department of World Languages and Cultures at the University of Utah, specializing in modern and contemporary Latin American literature and culture. His research examines the changing historical relation between culture and the state in Latin America. And his most recent publications include case studies on literary and cultural production from Colombia, Paraguay, the Amazon region, and Central America. At the University of Utah, he regularly teaches courses on 19th and 20th century Spanish American fiction, cultural history, and intellectual trends. Those are impressive bios. So we thank our guests for coming, and Keri, I'll just turn the time over to you to give your presentation. And then after that, Keri and Alejandro will engage in a dialogue about the presentation, and then the viewers can submit questions via the Q&A button. So Keri, I turn the time over to you.
Okay, thank you, Nathan. Thank you, Alejandro, for being here, and thank you, everyone, for attending this webinar on the celebration of the Mexican independence. Reflections on Octavio Paz's The Labyrinth of Solitude. Today is September the 16th, the anniversary of the Mexican independence, the celebration of the cry of Dolores, El Grito de Dolores, when a priest, Miguel Hidalgo y Costilla, converted himself into a hero, giving the calls to arms and starting the War of Independence 210 years ago. The celebration of independence might feel like a contradiction for Mexicans. For some, it is still the honorable commemoration of freedom and independence that took place in an idealized remote past. For others, the cry of Dolores has become a cry of pain rather than of freedom. The independence of Mexico is today a symbolic yet meaningless celebration, which reaffirms the contradiction of a country that, while achieving its independence over 2 centuries ago, it is still not completely free. Mexico is a country where levels of violence indicate that the state is unable to guarantee the safety of its citizens, especially of women, since femicides keep going on the rise nationwide every year under the indifference of Mexican authorities, and where the number of the disappeared has increased to over 173,000 people, the vast majority of them since the drug-related war began in 2006. Today, Mexico is far from being the idealized country that the caudillos of the Mexican Revolution, like Emiliano Zapata, imagined. Paz would probably be more concerned by the current world political trend in which xenophobic practices and nationalist values are back and even exacerbated than by the pandemic that has radically modified our modes of socialization. The world today, 70 years after the first publication of The Labyrinth of Solitude, seems to be collapsing in its human values while paradoxically, it still continues its march. Octavio Paz was born in 1914 into a middle-class intellectual family and amidst the chaos of the Mexican Revolution. One has to take in consideration when reading The Labyrinth that Paz is a son of the revolution, whose father, a lawyer and a journalist, worked for Zapata's movement defending peasants in their land demands. Thus, for Paz, the Mexican Revolution is key to understand Mexican history, from the Aztec Empire to contemporary times, for it represents the connection between the ancestral lost paradise of Mexicans and modernity. As he pointed out in an interview with Claude Fell in 1975, quote, "The Labyrinth is a book of social, political, and psychological criticism. It is a description on the one hand of certain attitudes and an essay on the other on historical interpretation," end quote. Paz valued history as a way of understanding his collective and personal past. Therefore, it is not a patriotic homage to Mexican history, but rather it is an attempt of the author to understand the complexity of his own Mexican identity, both within Mexican territory and abroad, through the exploration of history, literature, and philosophy. As Jesus Chavarria states, quote, "It is vitally important to note from the start that Paz was led to examine Mexicanidad, paradoxically, due to his exposure to a foreign culture," end quote. But also, the author was inspired to the hard task of decipher identity as an endless search for meaning, just comparable to a labyrinthine experience in which solitude sometimes might be the only exit. When The Labyrinth was first published, it provoked an outrageous response in the Mexican population, and even if it was first intended to reach more of an intellectual audience, immediately imprinted itself in the Mexican collective imaginary. Many Mexicans might have never read it, but a great majority knows the book, and that Paz did not make a good portrait of them. It is not an exaggeration to say that in many ways, The Labyrinth has influenced the way the world perceives Mexicans. And this is part of the reason for which the reception of the book in Mexico was not very welcome, and probably the reason for which it did not receive many literary reviews at the time. Even one of the author's fellow poets told him once that he had written an elegant insult against Mexican mothers. To this day, The Labyrinth is still perceived as a book against Mexico and as a misrepresentation of Mexican identity. In the words of the scholar Enrico Mario Santi, The Labyrinth, quote, "It was and continues to be a polemical book, as it is a complex mixture of essays on morals, philosophical meditation, cultural anthropology, psychohistory, and autobiography. In other words, reading The Labyrinth of Solitude is much like viewing heterogeneous objects juxtaposed in a collage," end quote. Even when a large part of Paz's book is an analysis of Mexican history, one has to understand that, as Santi states, quote, "History can never be reduced to character," end quote. Then my analysis focuses on reflecting about the premises that made the book controversial and that influence the way we think about Mexican identity in contemporary times. I use Stuart Hall's theory to analyze Paz's main arguments. Hall argues that only through the position that recognizes cultural identity in constant transformation can the traumatic character of the colonial experience be properly understood, and not through the position that recognizes a cultural identity as a single absolute and immovable truth. Hall theorizes about cultural identity as a practice of representation and production, and not as it is traditionally conceptualized. That is, as a set of given cultural characteristics or as a synonym for folklore. In other words, for Hall, cultural identity is not one that is artificially imposed on a community or minority, but rather a production that is always in a continuous process that, moreover, does not come from outside, but from within each culture and each identity. One has to remember that Hall also establishes a dialogue with the deconstructionist theory that states that meaning is never finished. For this, any attempt for defining cultural identity will always lead to an unfinished product, always open to different interpretations and meanings. Hall also points out that we all write and speak from a particular place and time, that is, from a specific history and culture. In this sense, the Labyrinth of Solitude should be understood as an unfinished product open to different interpretations. In addition, it is important to remember that the place and time of enunciation from which Paz wrote his book is both a post-revolutionary and a post-war context. And also, it is noteworthy that he owes part of his ideas on the labyrinth to Nietzsche and Freud. One of the main arguments of Paz's book is that he attributes the trauma of Mexicans to the ongoing colonization that Mexico went through, not just during the conquest and the colonial period, but also during the foreign invasions of France and the United States. According to the author, Mexicans wanted to forget a past that they have long negated, and in their search for identity, they enter a labyrinth of loneliness and contradictions from which they manage to escape only for very brief moments. Quote, "The Mexican does not want to be either an Indian or a Spaniard, nor does he want to be descended from them. He denies them, and he does not affirm himself as a mixture, but rather as an abstraction. He is a man. He becomes the son of nothingness. His beginnings are in his own self," end quote. According to Paz, in order to transcend their condition of orphanhood and solitude, Mexicans must return to their origins, to the maternal womb, to understand whom they are behind the masks that history has put on them. At defining Mexicans as hijos de la chingada, the author reopens the wound of a past that Mexicans have long negated. Thus, the return to the maternal womb, La Chingada's womb, is the only way Mexicans can save their present and imagine a new way of being and a more promising future. But since Mexicans do not accept themselves as mestizos, because in doing so, they would have to accept themselves as sons of La Chingada, they rather negate themselves. At the time of its first publication, The Labyrinth confronted not only the criticism of the Mexican intelligentsia of his time, but also defied an entire country when describing his countrymen as the sons of La Malinche, and by describing it as La Madre Chingada. Malintzin, Malinali, Marina, or Malinche, all these names belong to the native slave woman who became the interpreter, advisor, and in turn, one of the most important characters of the conquest, as well as one of the women of Hernán Cortés, the Spaniard conqueror. Malinche later gave birth to one of the first mestizos in history, Martín Cortés, who would have become the first son of La Chingada, according to Paz. But it's not until the 20th century, after the Labyrinth's publication, when Malinche began to be known as La Chingada. Thus, the phrase, the sons of La Chingada, describes Mexicans as the product of violence and betrayal, myth that was created by Paz and that since then has been a big part of the idiosyncrasy of contemporary Mexico. La Chingada in Mexico is also an abstract concept with countless meanings depending on the context in which it is used. It is a noun, a verb, and an adjective that sometimes includes sexual connotations. Based on Paz's theory, La Malinche is the traitor of the Mexican race, and therefore Mexicans, la raza mestiza, is the offspring of that betrayal, as Paz writes, quote, if La Chingada is the representation of the violated mother, it is appropriate to associate her with the Conquest, which was also a violation, not only in the historical sense, but also in the very flesh of Indian women. Doña Marina becomes a figure representing the Indian women who were fascinated, violated, or seduced by the Spaniards. And as a small boy will not forgive his mother if she abandons him to search for his father, the Mexican people have not forgiven La Malinche for her betrayal. She embodies the open, the chingado, end quote. Through his analysis of La Chingada, Paz commits himself an unforgivable transgression towards his fellow Mexicans, not just by reopening the wounds of the trauma of colonization, as he interprets it, but also as representing them as bastards. Quote, the hijo de la chingada is the offspring of violation, abduction, or deceit, end quote. This is one of the arguments for which many Mexicans despise the Labyrinth, but also for which is now one of the fundamental readings of the Mexican canon. It is worth mentioning that in the decade of 1960, feminists started challenging Paz's patriarchal views by questioning the real role of Malinche through a gender lens. As Jose Antonio Flores writes, quote, feminists, especially Chicanas, praise her as a woman who managed to emancipate herself from a double patriarchal system in which, in effect, she developed as a kind of proto-feminist. End quote. Though, as Flores also states, the forgers of the Mexican national identity will her as the archetype of a traitor and as the most obstinate denier of their homeland. It is worth noting that Paz uses the figure of La Malinche almost as Christianism used Eva to make her responsible for the original sin. But Paz made the mistake of overlooking the intelligence and the key role Malinche played in the Conquest by representing her subjectively from the patriarchal canon, as Flores affirms. Quote, without her, the Conquest would have not been possible, or it would have cost much more in terms of human lives and ecological devastation, end quote. Later on, Glorian Saldua in Borderlands, La Frontera, the new mestiza, would also challenge this view by doing her own interpretation of La Malinche from a queer, feminist, and Chicana perspective. Quote, the worst kind of betrayal lies in making us believe that the Indian woman in us is the betrayer. We, Indias y mestizas, police the Indian in us, brutalize and condemn her. Male culture has done a good job on us. Son las costumbres que traicionan. La India en mí es la sombra, la chingada, la solteotl, cuatlicue. Son ellas que oyemos lamentando a sus hijas perdidas. End quote. Octavio Paz's controversial comments about La Malinche have triggered endless dialogues about La Chingada among Mexicans and between authors and scholars. In this sense, his book has proved two things. In the first place, that cultural identity is indeed an unfinished product, and therefore that the Labyrinth does not possess the ultimate interpretation about Mexican history, nor about Mexicanidad. And in second place, it reveals as well the predominant patriarchal perspective that dominated Paz's interpretation on Mexican history by misrepresenting women. On the other hand, even when the Labyrinth was not intended to be a treatise on Mexicanidad, Paz's reflections in the first essay of the book, The Pachuco and Other Extremes, demonstrate the author's interest to define Mexican identity in the diaspora as well, specifically Mexicans living in the United States by defining them as follows, quote, the Pachucos are youths, for the most part of Mexican origin, who form gangs in southern cities. The Pachuco does not want to become a Mexican again. At the same time, He does not want to blend into the life of North America. The Pachuco has lost his whole inheritance, language, religion, customs, beliefs. His disguise is a protection, but it also differentiates and isolates him. It both hides him and points him out, end quote. Paz's attempt to unmask Mexicans start with the figure of the Pachuco, perhaps because, as Santi explains, quote, if Pachucos inspire his meditation, it is because with them the author shares the alienation of exile, end quote. As Paz begins to outline his idea about the contradictory character of his countrymen and their existential state of solitude, he overlooks American imperialist practices and the cultural hybridity that characterizes Chicano identity as a result of the imposition of a new culture on them through the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848. In this regard, Daniel Lamb points out, quote, Mexicans living in the diaspora struggle to locate and situate themselves not only in their homeland, but also in the consciousness of their past, navigating through linguistic and cultural hybridity, end quote. By not being able to fully understand the Mexican-American idiosyncratic struggle, the author's definition of the Pachuco ends up creating a strong stereotype, describing it as a tangle of contradictions who do not attempt to vindicate the race or the nationality of their forebears. Furthermore, the Pachuco is the first Mexican in the 20th century who becomes a son of La Chingada, or a malinchista under Paz's perspective. Being the Pachuco and other extremes the first essay of the book, it could also be read as the first misrepresentation of the labyrinth that has provoked a wide and long-lasting reaction among the Chicano community. Paz's exhortation to Mexicans to confront their past and return to their origins was also a sort of provocation, or rather, an insult for Mexican Americans who had experienced the trauma of a second colonization and who have been expatriated from the maternal womb twice. Paz's stereotype of the Pachuco simplifies the condition of Chicanos. In the Pachuco and other extremes, the author enunciates and defines Pachucos from a Mexican, yet outsider's perspective. And even when at the time there was not much written on Chicano studies, his lack of knowledge and understanding of the cultural experience of Mexican Americans leaves his analysis of the Pachuco at a superficial level. Two pivotal historical moments highlighted by Paz are the Mexican independence and the revolution. The former being the historical movement in which Mexicans affirmed themselves for the first time against the others, the enemies, the bad Mexicans, the traitors, in other words, against los hijos de la chingada. The latter being a unique movement because it proposes a return to the roots, a return to the oldest of the traditions, the common distribution of the land, el ejido. However, Paz does not see at the base of these two historical events a brilliant or universal ideology like that of Simón Bolívar. However, at their core, both the Mexican independence and the revolution were radical insofar as they were movements by the people for the people, and not movements of liberation gestated by intellectuals or aristocrats. Specifically, the Mexican Revolution was, in Paz's word, quote, a return to the past, a search for our own selves. Thanks to the revolution, the Mexican wanted to reconcile himself with his history and his origins. It was a return to the maternal womb. Therefore, it was also a fiesta, end quote. Paz saw in the revolution a historical moment that could have been the answer to the labyrinth of solitude of Mexicans. But when the rebel movement finally manifested itself as that idealized return to the origins, it also became institutionalized in a political party, the PRI, which ended up ruling the country for 71 years. Thus, the present for Mexicans faded again to give way to the nostalgia of the glorious past of that radical movement that lasted nearly 2 decades, and that for brief moments made Mexicans live their orphan and solitary states. But even more than the revolution, Zapatism had an impact on Paz's views at a personal level, as he recognizes in the Return to the Labyrinth, quote, "My father thought that Zapatismo was Mexico's truth. I believe he was right. As I tried to explain in the Labyrinth of Solitude, what distinguished Zapatism from the other factions was its attempt to return to the origins," end quote. Paz intuited that Zapatism had been the only movement with the possibility of healing the wounds of the past and creating a more promising future for Mexicans. As he stated, quote, "Zapata is beyond the controversy between liberals and conservatives, Marxists and neo-capitalists. Zapata is before, and perhaps, if Mexico is not extinguished, he will be after," end quote. For some, Paz's statements might seem now prophetic, since currently the only revolutionary movement in Mexico is the Zapatista Army of National Liberation, SZLN, whose fight started on January 1st of 1994, when they took up arms for 12 consecutive days against the Mexican army, transcending later their original armed struggle into a decolonial project in which autonomous communities are building a world where many worlds fit, under the main principle, command, obeying the people. Neo-Zapatistas, most of them of indigenous origin, have not had the need to return to their roots because they have not distanced themselves from them. Therefore, their identity has not been distorted nor manipulated by a capitalist system or by the official version of history. Neo-Zapatistas are retelling the story of Mexico in the sense that Stuart Hall explains said when he says that cultural identity is not fixed and that is also produced based on a re-story of the past that is always in motion and it is never completed. Furthermore, unlike in Paz's book, which overlooks or misrepresents Mexican women, the Zapatista Army of National Liberation has showed that feminism and gender equality is as important as social and economic justice. As Maria del Pilar Padierna points out, quote, "The emergence of the Zapatista Army of National Liberation, in a particular way, it allows the visibility of indigenous Zapatista women as subjects with demands and interpellations," end quote. If, as Hall points out, there is a difference between the production of identity and the return to the origins, then the Mexican Revolution achieved a return to the origins, but produced a national identity that is just alive in the Mexican collective imaginary as a myth, as Paz asserts, quote, "Its cultural and artistic fertility resulted from the profound manner in which its heroes, bandits, and myths stamped themselves forever on the sensibility and imagination of every Mexican," end quote. However, the current politics of Mexico are influenced more due to nostalgia for the past than a retelling of history. Neo-Zapatismo, on the contrary, it is a living being rather than a myth, and it also represents a social and political alternative to the official one that permeates the political scene of contemporary Mexico. Neo-Zapatistas are retelling the story and at the same time healing the wound of Mexican history, to which both Saldua and Paz refer through different perspectives, by retelling their past in a dignifying way that even allows them to reimagine a different future. The Zapatista Army have achieved a sense of community and identity that the rest of the Mexicans don't have or have never experienced under the following principles, quote, obedecer y no mandar, to obey, not command, proponer y no imponer, to propose, not impose, representar y no suplantar, to represent, not supplant, convencer y no vencer, to convince, not conquer, construir y no destruir, to construct, not destroy, servir y no servirse, to serve others, not serve oneself, bajar y no subir, to work from below, not to seek to rise. Even more neo-Zapatistas might be the only Mexicans who have shed their mask despite having their face covered. Anyone wanting to know more about Mexican politics, culture, and identity would do well to take a close look at neo-Zapatismo. They are the silent threat of the Mexican oligarchy, the threat of los señores del dinero, and even de los señores del mundo, since they have set an example of freedom and autonomy even across borders. Though neo-Zapatismo, as Zapatistas explains themselves, quote, is not a new political ideology or a rehash of all ideologies. Zapatismo is nothing. It does not exist. It only serves as a bridge to cross from one side to the other. Everyone fits within Zapatismo, everyone who wants to cross from one side to the other, end quote. For the past 26 years, neo-Zapatismo has been the counterpart of Mexico's corrupted political system, and especially of the PRI, which ironically originated in the Mexican Revolution, for which Paz affirms in the Return to the Labyrinth of Solitude, quote, no one can understand Mexico if he overlooks the PRI, end quote. And even when this political party lost power in 2000, after 71 years of ruling the country, its influence and its ravages are still visible in the current Mexican political scene, as it keeps expanding its power under different masks, such as re-emerging under the name of the National Regeneration Movement, Morena, the political party founded by the current president of Mexico, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, who back in the days was also an active member of the PRI. Thus, if Paz had ever imagined a new future for Mexico, that probably would have been Zapatismo as we currently know it, and not the monolithic ideology forged as a result of the Mexican Revolution that created heroes that are worshipped just during national holidays or patriotic celebrations. As the Subcomandante Galeano, formerly known as Subcomandante Marcos, has stated, quote, Zapatismo is not an ideology. It is not a bought and paid for doctrine. It is an intuition, end quote. At attempting to define Mexican identity through his interpretation of history, Paz proposes Mexicans a return to the past, a search for their origins, as a way out of their labyrinth of loneliness. However, in the last essay of the book, The Dialectic of Solitude, he recognizes solitude as a condition of all humankind, and not only of Mexicans. Quote, solitude, the feeling and knowledge that one is alone, alienated from the world and oneself, is not an exclusively Mexican characteristic. All men, at some moment of their lives, feel themselves alone, and they are. Solitude is the profoundest fact of the human condition, end quote. Towards the end of the labyrinth, the reader notes the author's search becomes more existential than historical, for which Santi affirms that, quote, the analogies that Paz makes throughout his book demonstrate that its argument is ultimately poetic. It works through an analogy, not through logical proof, end quote. Defining Mexican identity was not as important for Paz as his search for identity in itself, as he states in Postdata, or the Other Mexico, in 1970. Quote, The Mexican is not an essence, but a history. I was and am intrigued not so much by the national character as by what that character conceals, by what is behind the mask." End quote. This citation is the proof that still 20 years after of having written The Labyrinth, Paz's search for meaning was not over. In fact, it reflects that it was an endless search for personal meaning. Postdata was not just an addition to The Labyrinth, but also the response that the author gave to the authoritarian government of Gustavo Díaz Ordaz, responsible for the Tlatelolco massacre in October 2nd of 1968, in which the Mexican army killed hundreds of unarmed people due to the students' protests. In his postscript, Paz ponders the reasons for which students and its protests were repressed in such a radical and brutal way, being one of the Mexican writers who protested and raised his voice about that tragic episode of Mexican history at the time. The Labyrinth of Solitude was Paz's personal attempt to understand Mexican history and define Mexican identity, but above all, it was a search to discover what was behind the mask of Mexicans, behind the myth, as he explains, quote, "I think The Labyrinth of Solitude was an attempt to describe and understand certain myths. At the same time, insofar as it is a literary work, it has in turn become another myth." End quote. Much remains to be said not only about how Mexico has evolved since 1950, year of the first publication of The Labyrinth, but also about how the entire world has changed since then, and how all colonial practices are still present and continue to affect our current reality, as well as the way we perceive ourselves, either under the mask of a nationality or under the mask of a past that perhaps does not allow us to imagine a future based on the principles of freedom, equality, and human dignity, as neo-Zapatistas are certainly doing today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gonzalez. That was a very profound presentation. And now I will basically allow Alejandro to ask some questions, and why don't you two dialogue for a moment?
Sure.
Okay. Well, first, thank you, Keri, for this very interesting presentation. I also wanted to thank Nathan for organizing this event and for inviting me to participate. As I was preparing for today, I decided to read again some sections from The Labyrinth. This is a book that I read once during my undergraduate years back in my country, in Colombia, and then maybe a second time several years ago when I was a graduate student here in the United States. And since then, until today, I had not read The Labyrinth. So I have to say that my image of the book until recently has been pretty vague, pretty blurry. And now that I read it again, what struck me about this book is this tension between, on the one hand, you have this constant search for identity, the return to origins, a certain search for an essence of Mexicanness and so on. And on the other hand, is like the author faces the impossibility of clearly defining an identity or finding or returning to origins at the same time. So it's a very interesting dichotomy, a very interesting tension that we have in this book. And I read the book as exhibiting basically this tension, you know, as exhibiting this failure to find origins, to find identity, right? Because what we get here are just figures of uprootedness, orphanhood, contamination. So any purity at the end is impossible, you know. So and I like how you, Keri, were reading what you were reading Paz like against the grain, basically, right? and of course, this is the result of the metaphorical and historical material that the author is working with, right? I mean, I'm referring to La Malinche, La Chingada, De Pachuco, which are figures that subvert any easy identitarian categorizations, right? And any easy narratives of legitimate origins. So maybe just to start the conversation, I wonder, Keri, if the actuality, the relevance of this text today lies precisely in that it can never accomplish what it sets out to do, right? So instead of returning to origins, it's very difficult for Paz to actually, delimit those origins or any identitarian discourse or stabilize any identitarian Mexicanness or so on. No? So just to start, I mean, what would be the relevance, of the text, regarding this basic like narrative failure of the author and in his essay, and the fact that maybe this is why the text is still so attractive today, right?
Yeah, so I consider that the relevance of the Labyrinth in current times is that even when it is still a book that is seen as a text against Mexicans, it has the value that provides keys to understand the Mexican political scene and through the interpretation of history. Because as Paz interprets history, he provides an understanding of the past, but also of the present of Mexico. And also one of the relevant things is that it keeps producing endless dialogues about Mexican identity. Of course, in their reviews to the original text, Paz recognizes that he failed, that he couldn't define Mexican identity. One thing that I believe, like he didn't know, is that he was lacking the use maybe of other type of theories, but the main theories that he used to write the Labyrinth were philosophical doctrines. Like he used and psychoanalytic, like he was using Freud, Nietzsche, even Marx had a great influence of the writing of his text.
Yeah. So yeah, maybe the part that I really enjoyed most, while rereading this text is basically that, yeah, that it fails, but that failure is, I mean, reading it from a contemporary perspective is productive somehow, right? Because the text remains open, right?
Absolutely.
So you also talk about the Paz as a very controversial figure, not only in Mexico but probably abroad. And what is interesting about his personal history is that he was influenced by most of the progressive causes of the 20th century, right? The Mexican Revolution, of course. He sided with the Republicans during the Spanish Civil War. He participated in anti-fascist coalitions in Europe when he worked in Europe. And he supported the student movement in 1968 as well. Yet at the same time, he had a very problematic relationship with the left, and with many so-called progressive intellectuals at the time. Even neo-Zapatistas criticized him quite a bit, right? So I wonder if you can talk a little bit about how to situate Paz politically, in 20th century Mexico and in Latin America and beyond, perhaps, because he identified with progressive causes, yet at the same time, the progressive bloc never really accepted him and criticized him quite a lot.
Well, Paz was a very contradictory identity in himself. Like, as at the same time that he was protesting for the massacre, the Tlatelolco massacre, and probably you must know that he symbolically resigned to his position as ambassador in India when that happened. Yet he kept collecting his salary. So he received a lot of criticism from his
Oh,
Mexican writer fellows. Like, he also had ties with the political power. The project of the magazine Vuelta was founded by Televisa. So he had relationship ties with with powerful political figures in Mexico. So at the same time that he was an excellent intellectual essayist and an amazing poet, I mean, he was awarded with the Nobel Prize for literature. He still was, and maybe the reason for which he was not a leftist is one of the reasons for which he received the prize. But he was this controversial figure. He was also not our Pablo Neruda. He was not the poet of the Mexican people. He was not the voice of the Mexican people, and that is why what it like makes him a very controversial intellectual figure, because he didn't, like, Mexicans don't feel represented by the literature of Octavio Paz,
mhm.
and Mexicans identified more with other poets like Jose Emilio Pacheco, Rosario Castellanos, I mean, of that time, right? So yeah, he was very much a controversial figure. Like, at the same time that he was creating all these um, literature considered a part of high culture, he was still, like, he had connections with the political power. Like, I mean, he was a diplomat almost for a big part of his life.
Mhm. Yeah. And one final question,
Mhm.
I'll stop here, is could you talk a little bit more about the relationship, the conceptual relationship between the labyrinth and Glorian Saldua's theory of the La Frontera?
Yeah, of course. So I think the dialogue between these two texts is established because both authors recognize that there is a wound that is still bleeding, and that is the result of the colonization. So, but while Paz proposes to Mexicans to search for their origins and go back to their past and find this communion with the mother, even though the mother is a traitor, is La Chingada. So, Gloria and Saldua challenge this view of Paz,
Mm.
and she reconfigures the character, the historical character of La Chingada, and challenges the view that made of the Mexican hegemonic patriarchal cultural view that made her the traitor. So also, and I think that's the main connection between the two texts. They both share the idea of the open wound, but from different perspectives. Glorian Saldua was analyzing history, was interpreting history from her perspective of as Chicana, as a woman, as a lesbian.
Okay, well, thank you. So let's turn to questions from the viewers, right?
Yeah, let me just read some of the questions that have been submitted. So this is a question from Patrick Cheney. He says, could you speak to depictions of indigeneity in fiction by prominent Mexican literary figures, such as Elena Garro, Rosario Castellanos, or perhaps even Juan Rulfo, inasmuch as elements of his writing may reflect indigenous cosmologies? and how it is similar or distinct from the analysis presented in Labyrinth of Solitude.
Yeah, I mean, all those authors that he is referring to are like key to understand in indigenous culture. But although like Rosario Castellanos, Juan Rulfo approached the problem of the indigeneity from a different perspective than Paz. They both were like, Paz was trying to define Mexican identity, while Rosario Castellanos and Juan Rulfo were not trying to define Mexican identity. They were talking about the problems as a result of the struggle of the post-revolutionary period, and all the good things that the revolution brought to Mexico, all the progress, but also all the poverty that was, all the progress that was not reaching the entire country. So I think that Rulfo and Castellanos make evident that the progress of the Mexican Revolution didn't reach the entire population. So they are talking more about what were the consequences of the Mexican Revolution, and there are like examples of that in like Nos han dado la tierra de Juan Rulfo, in which the land that was distributed by through the outcome of the revolution was infertile, and that Mexicans couldn't do anything with that, and that's very symbolic, and is also the metaphor of the current state of things in Mexican politics. Like Mexicans right now don't, as a Mexican, I think that we don't see a way out to the future. We are stuck in the past, in the images of the Mexican Revolution still. And at the same time, the only movement that represents these subaltern identities that are no longer subaltern because they raise their voice in a way are the only alternative we have to our current situation.
Thanks. We have another question from Liliana Lopez. She asks, machismo is rooted in the Mexican society, men and women. Paz portrayed a decomposed society, hijos de la Malinche, the same society that consciously or unconsciously is tolerating violence against women. The problem is not a government. The problem is the figure of the Chingada, raising their sons to be machos, entitled to chingar and raising their daughters to accept to be undermined.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I understand what Liliana is saying. Certainly, like La Chingada, the problem is the image that we have about La Chingada, that the problem that we have, the image that we have about women in Mexico. But even though Octavio Paz forged this stereotype of La Chingada, machismo existed even before the text. The only thing that the text does is to probably exacerbate the idea of the woman as La Chingada, as the one that's the vulnerable one, as the traitor. And with that, we can go back to this idea of Christianism, that Eva was also the one with the blame for the original sin. So again, we have also a problem of of machism, but also of patriarchalism that we haven't solved to these days. But that, for example, the EZLN has also an alternative project of feminism, and in which is like Zapatism, neo-Zapatism is more inclusive in that sense. Our contemporary Mexican society has still a very big problem of machism, and that is the result of so many femicides.
So Lilian has another question. She asks, Octavio Paz never wrote novels, and in his relation with the theater was non-existent. I'm more interested in the latter situation because historically there is a profound relation between poetry and drama. Many great poets have written plays and many great playwrights have written poetry. But Paz never did, and it seems to me that he disdained that genre. What is your opinion about it?
So he has a play that is called El Mono Gramático, the grammatical monkey, and he was inspired to write that play while he was ambassador in India. Yeah, he decided not to work in the novel, in the genre of the novel. I think that's a kind of, personally, I think that's a personal personal decision that authors make. I mean, Jorge Luis Borges, decided that he just wanted to write short stories and poetry, and he didn't want to write novels because he didn't think he was capable of writing a novel. Octavio Paz never accepted such thing like that. He didn't say that he didn't feel capable of writing novels, but Octavio Paz from the very beginning showed a deep love for poetry. So I think that's his main legacy. And yeah, I mean, I think that's a personal decision that a writer makes, and that has the right to make what genre they want to work on. I don't see it as a negative thing. Maybe I'm missing something.
We have several messages on the chat function. This is a question from, and he's from Utah Humanities, Willie Palomo. He asks, what relationship did the Labyrinth of Solitude have with the myth of mestizaje, in particular with the folks like Jose Vasconcelos? Was he friendly to white supremacist notions of Mexican identity?
Well, it's interesting that I like that question, because in reality, like what Octavio Paz says in the Labyrinth is that Mexicans negate that they are mestizos. They negate their Spanish roots as well as the Aztec or pre-Hispanic origins. And he also admired the work of Vasconcelos very much. But he disagreed with him in the sense that he thought that Vasconcelos was creating a myth of the Mexican race. And it's ironic because I think that at the same time, Octavio Paz was creating also a myth of Mexican identity. He actually created a myth of Mexican identity that is across borders now, that goes across borders.
Well, I have a question, if you allow me to ask one. There is much mention in this book about the idea of masks, and I'm wondering what form these masks take in a person's everyday, ordinary life. What do these masks look like? And are these masks consciously worn, intentionally worn, or are they so deeply kind of habituated in the reality of living life as a Mexican that you don't even notice them?
Well, yeah, well, the idea of the mask and what there is behind the mask and the words and the Mexican idiom came actually from Nietzsche. And Octavio Paz gives credit to Nietzsche for that. So he is the one who taught him how to think about how we all have masks, but Octavio Paz wanted specifically to know what there was behind the Mexican mask. So yeah, in that sense, I think we all have masks, and we might be using them without even noticing. And the masks also can be understood as the stereotypes that a culture creates about its own society.
Do you have anything else to add, Alejandro?
Well, not really. Maybe I would like to go back to the question of literary genres, Keri. And I mean, I am from Colombia. We normally know Octavio Paz for his essays, not so much for his poetry, right? And but of course, I mean, his main work is poetry. You know, his poetry production, etc. So I wonder if you have any considerations related to this tension between the ideas that he develops in his essays, and on the other hand his poetic aesthetics, which is apparently so different somehow, right? And a second question related to that somehow is, I mean, we know that Paz was highly influential, like founding literary journals, magazines, I mean, we know all those journals, Taller, Vuelta, Plural. So can you also talk a little bit about his role as a public intellectual in that sense, as a promoter of culture in Mexico and beyond?
Well, so the literary work, the essays of Octavio Paz, after the Labyrinth turning to like he keeps reflecting on history, but also he starts analyzing literature, and in the end it becomes like he has like in his later work he develops more like a poetic prose in which he delves into the topics of erotism, death, time, and even some ideas of Buddhism. So in that sense, I think that his poetic work was very intertwined with his what some people has criticized him as his essays, his last essays being more like a poetic prose than essays. So and in regards to his work as a promoter of the culture in Mexico, I mean, he certainly was a promoter of culture, but also I don't think he was an advocate of the popular culture or all the writers. Like he has a very reduced group of friends like Enrique Krause, for example. Like in the end, he was very good friends with Carlos Fuentes, but in the end, they distanced themselves. And it's interesting to notice too that Enrique Krause was part of this little circle in which they were very well connected with political figures. So all the promotion that he does to culture, it's very questionable because, as I said before, for example, Vuelta was a project that was related or that the funds came from Televisa, which was one of the mainstream TV companies in the back. So back in the day. So so he is also a very controversial figure as a promoter of culture in Mexico.
Thank you.
We have one more question from Willie Palomo. He asks, would Paz be considered a modernist in the ranks of folks like T.S. Eliot, Ezra Pound, and so forth? What relationship did he have with his Anglophone contemporaries?
Well, he definitely knew the work of Thomas Eliot and Ezra Pound, and I believe I read at some point that he had some influence from them. It is hard to define Octavio Paz as a modernist or as a surrealist or as an existentialist. Like, he is more like a, it's hard to define him as part of a movement, even because either because he was rejected by his contemporaries, or either because he refused to define himself as a part of a movement. So maybe in his early years were the only time in which he kind of identified himself with some groups like the surrealists, but officially he never accepted to be part of any of these groups. So if his literary work is modernist, well, that would be a different question. I don't think it's modernist. I think it's inserted within modernity, which is a different thing. But it's also hard to define like a main current in like a main movement in his literary work, because he was more interested in philosophy. He was more interested in poetry, and he was always like applying like all these philosophical doctrines to his work until the end, when he starts being more concerned with the topics of the topic of time, which is still very philosophical, right?
So let me end with one comment from Susan Vogel, and then one question from Fanny Blauer. Susan says, Octavio Paz came to the University of Utah in the 1980s. He gave lectures and read his poetry with U.S. Poet Laureate Mark Strand. Did you know that?
Oh, I didn't know that. It makes me very happy to hear that.
That's interesting, yeah. And so Fanny asked this last question. What can you say about the use of the word La Chingada as a full and deep context? We even have a book issued by the Fondo de Cultura Económica called El Chinganario. How is this relevant to his analysis now?
Well, you know, we Mexicans are very creative. So we know how to turn an insult into a very productive exercise of, you know, creation of several things. Like now we use that word in many ways. We use la chingada, the concept of la chingada, in many ways. I mean, I can say right now, like, soy una chingona, I am a chingona, or me chingaron, like I you know, I was screwed. So I believe that Mexicans have turned this concept into whatever they want, and that el chingonario and all these like rhetoric after the concept of la chingada coined by Paz, it's totally valid. I don't see it as a bad thing, although I do think that la chingada, some phrases might be in detriment of the machismo that is lived in our Latin American society, and especially in Mexico. So it depends on which context. Sometimes it could really hurt our society, and there are some contexts in which I think it's to some extent valid.